The water is black. Mahede is 24 years old, and she is standing at the edge of the Bosphorus in the hour before dawn, watching the surface of the straight ripple with currents that have carried bodies to the sea for 300 years. Her wrists are bound behind her back with silk cord, the same silk that adorned her chambers when she was still a favorite of the Sultan, when she slept on cushions embroidered with thread of gold and woke to servants who called her Light of the Harem. Now she stands in a cotton shift, barefoot on stones, still wet from the night's tide, her hair unbound and tangled by the wind that sweeps down from the Black Sea. The shift is thin enough that she can feel the cold penetrating to her bones, thin enough that the men who surround her can see the outline of her body beneath it. But modesty no longer matters. Nothing that happened to her body from this moment forward would be witnessed by anyone who would survive to speak of it. She can smell the water, salt, and rot, and something darker underneath, the accumulated residue of centuries of disposal. She can smell the sweat of the men beside her, the mutes who serve the bosi bashi, the chief gardener whose actual duties have nothing to do with gardens. She can smell her own fear, sharp and animal, cutting through the perfumes that still cling to her skin from the hammam where she was washed and prepared for this moment. They washed her carefully, almost tenderly. They oiled her hair and scented her skin and dressed her in white, as if preparing her for a wedding rather than an execution. The rituals of the harem extended even to death. A woman who had shared the Sultan's bed, who had borne the possibility of royal children, could not be disposed of carelessly. Her destruction required ceremony. Beside her on the stones rests a sack, canvas reinforced with leather at the seams, large enough to contain a human body. She has heard of these sacks since her first days in the harem, whispered about by older women who used them as warnings, as cautionary tales, as reminders of what happened to those who forgot their place. She never imagined she would see one prepared for her. The sack is not empty. She can hear sounds from within it, scratching, hissing, the rustle of scaled bodies moving against canvas, the high, desperate mewing of cats that have been starved for 3 days in preparation for this moment. She knows what will happen. She has known since the moment the Kuslaresa, the chief black eunuch, appeared at the door of her chamber with guards who did not speak. She knew when she was brought before the valid Sultan, the Sultan's mother, who pronounced judgment without allowing defense. She knew when the silk cord was wrapped around her wrists, and she was led through passages she had never seen before downstairs that descended into the foundations of the palace, through gates that opened onto the waterfront where the boats of the condemned were moored. She will be sewn into the sack with the animals. The sack will be weighted with stones and thrown into the Bosphorus. She will sink into the black water while the starving cats claw at her flesh, while the snakes strike at whatever warmth they can find. The weight drags her down into depths where no light penetrates. She will drown, but drowning will not be the worst of it. The worst will be the minutes before drowning. The chaos of animal terror combined with her own, the darkness and the cold, and the creatures that share her final moments. This is the punishment for what she has been accused of doing. Not convicted, accused. In the Ottoman harem, the accusation was the conviction. The Sultan's word was law, and the Sultan's mother spoke with the Sultan's voice in matters concerning the women of the palace. Mahideen was accused of betraying the Sultan with a palace guard. She was accused of violating the most fundamental rule of the harem. The rule that made the entire system possible was the certainty that every child born to a Sultan's woman was the Sultan's child. She was accused of contaminating the bloodline that had ruled the Ottoman Empire for 200 years. She was innocent. She had never touched the guard she was accused of taking as a lover. She had never touched any man except the Sultan himself, who had called her to his bed perhaps 24 times over the 3 years she had been a concubine of the imperial household. But her innocence was irrelevant. What mattered was that another woman, a rival who wanted her gone, had whispered the right words to the right ears. What mattered was that the valid Sultan believed, or chose to believe, or found it convenient to believe. What mattered was that Mahidevran had failed to produce a son in 3 years, making her expendable and making her removal a matter of housekeeping rather than tragedy. She thinks of her mother, who sold her to the slave traders when she was 12 years old because the family needed money for her brother's apprenticeship. She thinks of the years in the training house, learning the arts that would make her valuable: music, poetry, dance, conversation, and the 1,000 skills required of women who would serve in the houses of the powerful. She thinks of the day she was purchased for the Imperial Harem, the day she thought her fortune had been made, and the day she entered the Topkapi Palace believing she was ascending to a life of unimaginable luxury. She had not understood then what the luxury cost. She had not understood that the golden cage was still a cage, that the silk-lined walls could become a prison, and that the same system that elevated her could destroy her on the word of a jealous competitor. She understands now. The Basti Bashi approaches. He is a large man, his authority visible in his bearing, his face expressionless in the way that men who conduct state murders learn to keep their faces. He nods to the mutes who stand beside Mahidevran, and they grip her arms, lifting her slightly off the stones. "You may speak, the bastard," Basha says. "If you have final words, you may speak them now." Mahidevran considers. She could protest her innocence again. She could curse the rival who betrayed her. She could beg for mercy that will not be granted. She could pray to Allah for forgiveness of sins she did not commit. Instead, she speaks the truth that will be buried with her in the black water of the Bosphorus. "I was never unfaithful," she says. "I loved the Sultan. I would have given him sons if he had given me the chance. What is done to me tonight is murder, not justice." The based Bashi's expression does not change. He has heard such words before. Every woman who faces this death proclaims her innocence. Some of them are lying. Some of them are telling the truth. It makes no difference to him. His job is not to judge. His job is to carry out the judgment of others. "It is time," he says. The mutes move forward with the sack. What you are about to learn has been systematically suppressed by Ottoman historians who prefer to celebrate imperial glory rather than document imperial horror. The archives of the Topkapi Palace contain records of thousands of women who entered the harem and simply disappeared from documentation. Their fates indicated only by euphemisms that scholars have traditionally chosen not to examine closely. Tonight, you will learn what those euphemisms meant. You will learn about the punishment system that the Ottoman Empire developed to control the most valuable and dangerous women in the Islamic world. You will learn about the sack drownings, the silent borings, the living burials, the methods that were refined over 6 centuries of imperial rule. You will learn about the hierarchy of the harem, why some women were wives and others were concubines, what rights attached to each status, and how those rights affected the punishments available for their transgressions. You will learn why the Sultan's legal wives faced different deaths than his concubines, why some women were strangled while others were drowned, why some deaths were public warnings and others were silent disappearances. You will learn about the officials whose job it was to investigate, condemn, and execute the women of the imperial household. Atibashi with his mute executioners. The Quslar Asa, who served as prosecutor and judge. The valid sultan whose authority over the harem made her the most powerful woman in the empire and the most dangerous enemy any concubine could have. You will learn why other women of the harem were forced to witness these punishments. What function that witnessing served. Terror was used as a tool of governance in a world where hundreds of women competed for the attention of a single man. You will learn about the children, the sons who were strangled to prevent succession disputes, the daughters who were married off to eliminate potential claims, the pregnancies that were terminated because they came at inconvenient moments, the entire system of reproductive control that made the harem not merely a household but a machine for producing legitimate heirs while destroying any possibility of illegitimate ones. Subscribe if you want to understand what the Ottoman Empire actually was beneath the architectural beauty and the military conquests and the flowering of Islamic art and literature. Comment below telling me where you are watching from, because Mahi Devon is about to be sewn into that sack, and I'm going to tell you exactly what happens inside it. But before I describe what she experienced in the black water of the Bosphorus, I need to take you back. I need to show you how the Ottoman harem functioned, why it was designed the way it was, and why the punishments for women who violated its rules were so extraordinarily brutal. Because you cannot understand what happened to Mahi Devran without understanding the system that killed her and the logic that made her death seem necessary to those who ordered it. The Ottoman harem was not what Western imagination has typically portrayed. It was not primarily a collection of sexual playthings maintained for imperial pleasure, though that element certainly existed. It was fundamentally a political institution designed to solve a problem that had plagued every dynasty in human history: how to ensure a legitimate succession while preventing the conflicts that competing heirs inevitably created. The problem was acute for the Ottomans because of their particular combination of circumstances. They were an absolute monarchy with all power concentrated in the person of the Sultan. They practiced a form of succession that did not automatically favor the eldest son, meaning that any son might potentially inherit the throne. And they ruled an empire so vast and wealthy that the stakes of succession were almost unimaginably high. These conditions created a recipe for civil war. If multiple princes survived to adulthood, they would inevitably compete for the throne. That competition would divide the empire, weaken its military capacity, invite intervention by foreign powers, potentially destroy everything the dynasty had built. The Ottomans developed two complementary solutions to this problem. The first solution was fratricide. When a new sultan ascended the throne, he was expected and eventually required by law to execute all his brothers. This practice, formalized by Sultan Mehmed II in the 15th century, eliminated competing claims by the simple method of eliminating competitors. The new sultan's brothers were strangled with silk borings, a method that shed no blood and was considered appropriately dignified for royal persons. Their bodies were then buried with honors, their potential threats to stability removed. The second solution was the harem system. By controlling all reproductive access to the sultan, the harem ensured that only authorized children would be born. Every woman who might potentially bear a royal child was confined within the palace, watched constantly. Her sexuality managed by officials whose job was to know exactly when and with whom she had intercourse. No uncertainty about paternity could be permitted. The bloodline had to be pure. These two solutions were connected. The fratricide was possible only because the harem made it possible to know exactly who the sultaness' sons were. Without certainty about paternity, the killing of brothers would become genocide of all possible relatives, a practice even the Ottomans found impractical. And the harem's extreme measures for punishing infidelity were necessary because the stakes of illegitimate birth were so high a child of uncertain paternity might claim the throne. That claim might succeed. An impostor might rule the Ottoman Empire, breaking the sacred bloodline that gave the dynasty its legitimacy. The entire system of succession, the stability of the largest Islamic empire in the world, depended on absolute certainty that no such contamination could occur. This is why the punishments were so severe. This is why accusations were effectively convictions. This is why innocent women died alongside guilty ones. Why the system erred always on the side of elimination rather than risk. The cost of false positives, innocent women killed, was acceptable. The cost of false negatives, illegitimate children born, was catastrophic. The harem structure reflected these imperatives. At the top was the valid sultan, the sultan's mother, who ruled the harem with authority second only to the sultan himself. She had survived the system. She had borne a son who lived to take the throne. She had watched her son's brothers strangled and had accepted this as necessary. She understood exactly what the stakes were and exactly what measures were required to manage them. Below the valid sultan were the sultan's legal wives, the khadunans, of whom there could be no more than 4 according to Islamic law. These women had formal status legal rights, recognized positions in the imperial hierarchy. Their children were legitimate heirs. They could not be easily disposed of. Punishing a Khaden required process, justification, consideration of political implications. Below the Khadens were the concubines, the Iqbals, and the Gos. Women who had attracted the Sultan's attention and been called to his bed, but who had not been elevated to legal wife status. These women were more numerous, more expendable, more vulnerable. They had fewer protections. Their deaths required less justification. Below the concubines were the Corias, the general population of the harem, women who served in various capacities, but who had not yet attracted imperial attention. Some of these women would rise, most would not. They were the labor force of the harem, the servants and attendants who made the institution function. And threaded through this hierarchy were the eunuchs, the men who had been castrated specifically to serve in environments where unmodified men could not be trusted. The black eunuchs, the Kusarasa and his subordinates, were the administrators of the harem, the enforcers of its rules, the investigators of its violations. The white eunuchs served in other capacities throughout the palace. Together, they formed a bureaucracy of surveillance that monitored every aspect of her life. This was the system Mahidne entered when she was purchased for the imperial household at age 14. This was the world whose rules she learned to navigate over the following decade. This was the machine that would eventually kill her. Not for any crime she actually committed, but because the logic of the system made her elimination convenient. Now, let us return to the waterfront, where Mahidne stands before the sack that will become her death chamber. The mutes approach with professional efficiency. One holds the mouth of the sack open, while others lift Mahidne on, ignoring her struggles, and insert her feet first into the canvas interior. The movement disturbs the animals already confined within. She can feel them writhing against her legs as she descends into the sack, their bodies frantic with the same terror she feels. The cats are the first to attack. Starved, maddened by confinement. They do not distinguish between the legs that have suddenly invaded their prison and any other available target. Claws rake across her calves, her thighs drawing blood that the cats can smell, driving them to greater frenzy. She screams, but the sound is muffled as the sack rises around her, closing over her shoulders, her head sealing her in darkness. She is folded into a fetal position, her knees pressed against her chest, her bound wrists trapped behind her back. She cannot move, cannot protect herself, cannot do anything except feel the animals that share her confinement attacking her from every angle. The snakes are slower to respond than the cats, but more persistent. She feels them coiling around her limbs, their scales sliding across her skin, their bodies seeking warmth in the sudden darkness. Not all of them bite immediately. Some simply wrap themselves around whatever they can find. Constrictors responding to contact with a pressure that is their only defense. She feels one circling her neck, feels another sliding across her face, feels the pressure building as the creatures react to her movements with their own defensive instincts. And then the sack is sewn shut, the opening closed by quick stitches that seal her inside. She feels the stones being attached to the bottom, the weight that will drag her down into the depths of the Bosphorus. She feels herself lifted, carried, the rocking motion of the men who hold her, adding to the chaos of animal movement within. She cannot see the water approaching. She can only feel the moment when she becomes weightless, the instant of falling. The shock of cold as the sack plunges beneath the surface. The water enters through the canvas, not immediately, but steadily, filling the space around her, replacing air with the cold brine of the Bosphorus. The animal's frenzy intensifies as they feel themselves drowning. The cats claw desperately at anything within reach. The snakes bite reflexively at whatever touches them. Mahidne is bitten 11 times in the first 30 seconds. The wounds burn with venom that her body has no time to process. The claws have open gashes across her legs, her arms, her torso. wounds that bleed into water that grows redder with each passing moment. But the wounds are not what kills her. The water is what kills her. It fills her nose and mouth as she gasps for air that no longer exists. It fills her lungs as she inhales involuntarily, her body's reflexes overriding her mind's knowledge that there is nothing to breathe. She drowns in darkness, surrounded by creatures that are drowning with her. Her final sensations, a mixture of cold and pain and pressure, and the absolute knowledge that no one will ever know what happened to her in these final moments. The sack sinks. The current takes it. By the time the sun rises over the Bosphorus, there will be no trace that Mahé-Devran ever existed. The sack drowning was not the only method the Ottomans used to punish women accused of infidelity. It was not even the most common method, but it was among the most terrible. Reserved for cases where the offense was considered particularly egregious, or where the punishment needed to serve as a particularly emphatic warning. The history of this punishment predates the Ottoman Empire. Drowning in a sack with animals was practiced by the Romans, who called it puana kau, the punishment of the sack, and reserved it for those who murdered their parents. The Ottomans adopted and adapted the practice, applying it to women whose sexual transgressions were seen as comparable to parricide as murders of the dynasty's integrity. The choice of animals was deliberate. The cats represented domestic betrayal. Creatures of the household turned against their keeper. The snakes represented corruption, the contamination that infidelity introduced into the sacred bloodline. Together, they created a death that was not merely painful but symbolically appropriate, a punishment that fit the crime and the logic of Ottoman jurisprudence. The Bosphorus was the preferred location for these drownings because of its practical and symbolic properties. Practically, the currents carried bodies out to the Sea of Mara and eventually to the open Mediterranean, eliminating evidence and preventing recovery. Symbolically, the Bosphorus was the boundary between Europe and Asia, the heart of the Ottoman realm, the waterway that Constantinople had controlled for 1,000 years. To drown in the Bosphorus was to be rejected by the empire itself, cast out from the heart of civilization into oblivion. Other methods of execution were available for women of different status or for different categories of offense. The silent boring was reserved for persons of royal blood, including the Sultan's legal wives and his sisters and daughters. This method involved strangulation with a silk cord administered by mute executioners who could not reveal what they had witnessed. The victim was typically drugged or restrained beforehand, then strangled quickly. The pressure on the carotid arteries causing unconsciousness within seconds and death within minutes. The boring was considered more honorable than drowning. It was quicker, less painful, and left the body intact for proper burial. Legal wives who were convicted of infidelity, if they were convicted at all, typically faced this death rather than the sack, but conviction of a legal wife was rare. The political implications of executing a Khaden were severe enough that such actions required extraordinary justification. More often, wives who fell from favor were simply divorced and sent to the old palace, a separate establishment where former favorites and elderly women of the harem spent their remaining years in comfortable but permanent exile. Concubines had fewer protections. They could be drowned, strangled, poisoned, or simply disappeared without the formal processes that protected legal wives. Many were simply sold to other households, their departure from the harem recorded with euphemisms that concealed whatever offense had prompted their removal. Others were married to officials or soldiers disposed of through gifts that transformed potential problems into loyalty-building opportunities. The archive records show significant variation in how these punishments were applied across different reigns. Some sultans were relatively lenient, rarely ordering executions of harem women, preferring exile or disposal through sale and marriage. Others were brutal, conducting periodic purges that eliminated dozens of women at a time. The officials who administered harem justice formed a specialized bureaucracy with clearly defined roles and responsibilities. The Stanchu Bashu, the chief gardener, held what was perhaps the most euphemistically titled position in the Ottoman government. His nominal responsibility was the maintenance of the palace gardens, but his actual function was far darker. He commanded a force of several thousand men, the Boston, who served as palace guards, executioners, and disposal specialists. When someone needed to disappear, the Boston Basha arranged it. The title's gardening reference was not entirely arbitrary. The Boston Sheller did maintain the palace grounds, but they also maintained order through methods that required discreet execution and disposal. And gardens provided both cover for their activities and convenient locations for burial when burial was required. The beautiful grounds of the Topkapi Palace concealed more than flowers. The mutes who served under the Boston Basha were selected specifically for their inability to speak. They could not reveal what they witnessed. They could not testify about the deaths they administered. They were the Ottoman solution to the problem of executioners who knew too much. Men whose physical incapacity made them trustworthy in a role that required absolute secrecy. These mutes were typically deaf as well as mute. Their condition congenital rather than inflicted. They communicated through a system of signs developed specifically for palace service. A language that allowed them to receive commands and coordinate their activities without spoken words. They were valuable enough that the palace actively recruited such men, creating a specialized corps that handled the most sensitive work of imperial governance. The Kusler Asa, the chief black eunuch, served as the primary administrator of the harem itself. His responsibilities included managing the daily operations of the household, maintaining discipline among the women, and investigating any suspicions of improper behavior. He was the prosecutor in cases of infidelity, the official who gathered evidence, interrogated witnesses, and presented findings to the valid sultan or the sultan himself. The position was extraordinarily powerful. The Kusler Asa had access to the most private spaces of the palace, knowledge of the most secret affairs of the imperial family, influence over decisions that affected the succession itself. Several Kusler Alaru became major political figures, their access to the sultan through the harem translating into access to power that rivaled or exceeded that of the Grand Vizier. The black eunuchs who served under the Kusler Asa were sourced from Africa, typically from Ethiopia or Sudan. The term black referred to their origin rather than being purely descriptive, though most were indeed dark-skinned. They were castrated before puberty, then trained for palace service, their physical condition making them acceptable guardians of the harem in a way that intact men could never be. The castration was complete, involving removal of both testicles and penis. A procedure with high mortality rates that was performed outside Ottoman territory because performing it within the empire was technically illegal. The Ottomans did not create their own eunuchs. They purchased them from traders who operated in regions where the law did not apply. Those who survived the procedure and the subsequent training entered an institution that could provide significant power and wealth. Senior eunuchs lived comfortably, sometimes lavishly. They accumulated fortunes through gifts and bribes. They built networks of patronage that extended far beyond the harem. They became in their way members of the elite, their mutilated bodies, the price of admission to power that intact men of their origin could never have achieved. The valid sultan stood above all these officials in matters concerning the harem. Her authority was absolute within the women's quarters, her word final in questions of discipline and punishment. She could order investigations, pronounce verdicts, demand executions, all without reference to anyone except the sultan himself, who typically deferred to his mother in harem matters. This authority made the Viet Sultan extraordinarily dangerous to any woman who attracted her disfavor. The harem was filled with potential rivals for her son's attention. Women who might produce heirs who could threaten her position. Women whose influence over the Sultan might diminish her own. Managing these threats was part of her function, and the tools available for management included the full range of punishments the system provided. Let us now turn to the women who witnessed these punishments. The harem population who were required to observe what happened to those who violated the rules. The witnessing was mandatory and deliberate. When a woman was condemned for infidelity or other serious offense, The other women of the harem were assembled to watch her punishment administered. Sometimes this meant observing a strangulation in the harem itself. Sometimes it meant watching a condemned woman being led away toward the waterfront, her fate clear from the circumstances, even if the actual drowning occurred out of sight. The purpose of this witnessing was explicitly terroristic. The Ottoman administrators understood that controlling hundreds of women required more than physical barriers and unit guards. It required psychological control, the internalization of rules, the self-policing that came from genuine fear of consequences. A woman who had watched another woman sewn into a sack and dragged toward the Bosphorus would think very carefully before taking any action that might result in similar treatment. She would police her own behavior. She would avoid circumstances that might create suspicion. She would watch other women for signs of forbidden behavior because reporting such behavior demonstrated loyalty while failing to report it might suggest complicity. The system created an environment of pervasive surveillance that extended far beyond the official watchers. Every woman watched every other woman, knowing that her own safety might depend on being the first to report suspicious behavior rather than the second to be accused of concealing it. This environment shaped every relationship within the harem. Friendships were dangerous because friends might become liabilities. Rivalries were encouraged because rivals could be trusted to report each other. The isolation of individual women within the crowded institution was a feature, not a bug, a design element that prevented the formation of alliances that might challenge authority. The witnessing also served to normalize the violence. Women who observed executions repeatedly became accustomed to them, their shock diminishing with exposure, their capacity for horror depleted by repetition. This normalization made them less likely to resist when their own turn came, less likely to see their treatment as exceptional injustice rather than normal operation of a system they had lived with in their entire adult lives. Some women, perhaps many women, internalized not just the fear, but the logic. They came to believe that the punishments were justified, that women who violated the rules deserved what they received, that the system protected them as much as it threatened them. This internalization was the ultimate success of the terror, the creation of subjects who policed themselves because they believed the policing was right. The archive records include accounts of women who actively participated in the destruction of their rivals, who provided the accusations and testimony that led to executions, who watched the results with satisfaction rather than horror. These women had learned the system so thoroughly that they used it as a weapon, understanding that the rules applied to everyone and that skillful manipulation of accusations could eliminate competitors without requiring direct action. This was the environment Mahé Devan navigated for 10 years before her destruction. This was the world she learned to survive in, the games she learned to play, the dangers she learned to avoid. She avoided them successfully for a decade. But the system was designed so that successful avoidance was never permanent, so that the threat remained constant, so that every woman understood that her survival depended on factors that might change at any moment without warning or recourse. She had done nothing wrong, but wrong was defined by power, and power had decided she was expendable. The investigation that led to Mahé Devran's condemnation followed a pattern that had been repeated hundreds of times across Ottoman history. It began with an accusation. A rival whose name the records do not preserve whispered to the Kuzlar Asasa that she had observed suspicious behavior. Mahé Devran had been seen speaking with a palace guard. The conversation had been too long, too animated, too intimate in its posture and expression. Something inappropriate was happening. The accusation was almost certainly fabricated. The rival had reasons to want Mahé Devran gone, reasons connected to the complex politics of Harem hierarchy, to competition for the Sultan's attention, to calculations about whose children might eventually inherit power. The specific charges mattered less than the fact that charges had been made by someone whose word carried weight, because Larossi investigated as his position required. He questioned the guard who denied any improper relationship, He questioned slaves who had been present during the alleged conversation who had seen nothing unusual. He questioned Mahide herself, who proclaimed her innocence with what appears to have been genuine conviction. None of this mattered. The investigation had been initiated, and initiations required conclusions. The Quslar Asa could find evidence of wrongdoing and recommend punishment. He could find insufficient evidence and recommend dismissal. He could find evidence of false accusation and recommend punishment of the accuser instead. What he could not do was find nothing. The system did not permit investigations to simply fade away without determination. Once accusation was made, someone had to be held responsible. In this case, the determination fell along predictable lines. The accuser was a favorite whose word the Vidi Sultan trusted. The accused was a concubine whose failure to produce sons had already diminished her value. The political calculation was simple. Believing the accuser served power, while believing the accused served no one. The guard was beaten to death in a lower courtyard. His execution witnessed by other guards as a warning about inappropriate contact with her women. His confession extracted through torture provided the formal justification for Mahé Devran's condemnation, though the confession was almost certainly false. The words of a man who would say anything to make the pain stop. Mahé was brought before the Valide Sultan for formal judgment. The session was brief. The evidence was presented. The confession was read. Mahé was permitted to speak in her defense, but her words were dismissed as expected protestations from a woman caught in sin. The verdict was delivered. Guilty of infidelity, sentenced to death by drowning. The sentence was carried out that same night. No delay was permitted. Delay might allow the condemned to communicate with allies, to generate sympathy, to create problems for those who had ordered her destruction. Swift execution eliminated these risks. And so Mahé went to the Bosphorus and the sack and the death that we have already witnessed. But her story was not complete. Her death had consequences that the Valide Sultan had not anticipated. Ripples that spread through the harem and eventually into Ottoman history itself. The rival who had accused Mahé Devran was a woman named Nurbanu. She had come to the harem 5 years earlier, a captive from the Venetian territories, beautiful and intelligent and ruthlessly ambitious. She had attracted the Sultan's attention quickly, risen through the ranks of concubines, borne him a son who survived infancy, and positioned herself as a potential future allied sultan. Mahidien had been her primary obstacle. Mahide was senior, had been a favorite longer, had relationships and alliances that Nirvan lacked. Eliminating her opened the path that Nir Banu intended to walk. The accusation against Mahé Devran was not the first manipulation Nir Banu had performed. She had already disposed of 2 other rivals through similar methods. Accusation and investigation resulting in removal, if not death. She had learned how the system worked and how to make it work for her. But her success in eliminating Mahidien attracted attention that she had not sought. The Valide Sultan who had approved the elimination began to observe her new favorite with different eyes. A woman capable of destroying rivals was a woman capable of threatening anyone, including the Valide Sultan herself. The dynamic shifted. Nirvano found that her path to power was not as clear as she had believed. The Valide Sultan began favoring other concubines, distributing the Sultan's attention among multiple women, preventing any single woman from accumulating the influence that Mahidien's elimination had seemed to promise. Nirbonu adapted. She cultivated patience. She maintained her position without aggressive expansion. She waited for the Valide Sultan to die, which happened 8 years after Mahid's drowning, finally opening the path that Nirbanu had cleared. When her son eventually became Sultan, Nirbanu became Valide Sultan herself, the most powerful woman in the Ottoman Empire. She ruled the harem for over a decade, making and breaking fortunes, ordering punishments, manipulating the succession that had elevated her. She became one of the most influential Valide Sultans in Ottoman history, her political acumen shaping imperial policy in ways that extended far beyond the harem walls. and she continued to use the tools that had enabled her rise. Other women were accused. Other women were drowned, or strangled, or simply disappeared. The system that had killed Mahidevran continued operating with Niaban, now directing rather than manipulating it. The historical record suggests that Nurbanu ordered at least 12 executions of her women during her time as valid sultan. Some were undoubtedly guilty of the offenses charged. Others were almost certainly innocent, victims of the same political calculations that had destroyed Mahidevran. The pattern was consistent. Accusation, investigation, condemnation, execution, all performed according to forms that gave the appearance of justice while serving the purposes of power. Nirvana's own end came not through execution, but through natural death or possibly poison. The records are unclear. She died in 1583, having outlived her son and seen her grandson ascend to the throne. She was buried with honors appropriate to her rank, her crimes and manipulations concealed beneath the dignity of state mourning. Mahidevran received no such burial. Her body was never recovered from the Bosphorus. No tomb marks her existence. No historical record preserves more than fragments of her story. The outlines of a woman whose death enabled another woman's rise, whose innocence mattered less than her inconvenience. This was the truth the Ottoman system created, that innocence was irrelevant, that guilt was determined by power rather than evidence, that women lived and died according to calculations that had nothing to do with their actual behavior. The Ottoman harem system persisted for over 500 years, from the establishment of the imperial household in the 15th century until the abolition of the Sultanate in 1922. Across this span, thousands of women entered the system and an unknown number exited it through execution or other violent means. The exact numbers are impossible to determine. The records were deliberately obscured, the evidence destroyed, the bodies disposed of in ways that prevented recovery or identification. The archive contains euphemisms rather than explicit documentation. Women who were sent to the Old Palace might have been exiled or might have been killed. Women who departed the household might have been sold or might have been drowned. The language concealed as much as it revealed. What can be determined is that the violence was both systematic and spectacular. It was systematic in that it followed established procedures, involved designated officials, served recognizable functions within the imperial system. It was spectacular in that it was designed to be witnessed, to create terror, to demonstrate the consequences of violation so clearly that violation became unthinkable for most women most of the time. The punishment for infidelity was exceptional in its severity because infidelity threatened the foundation of the entire system. But other violations also carried brutal consequences. Insubordination could be punished with beating or exile. Theft could result in mutilation. Conspiracy or betrayal could bring death by methods as varied as the poisoned cup, the silken cord, or the anonymous knife. The women who survived in this environment learned to navigate by instinct as much as calculation. They learned to read the shifting currents of power, to sense when favor was turning, to position themselves to survive changes they could not predict. They learned that the rules were real, but their application was political. That following the rules provided no guarantee of safety, while violating them guaranteed destruction. Some thrived. The most successful women, those who eventually became cadets or even valid sultans, demonstrated abilities that would have made them formidable in any context. They were intelligent, perceptive, politically skilled, capable of managing complex relationships while pursuing long-term strategies. They used the system's tools as weapons while protecting themselves from those same weapons. Most did not thrive. Most remained in the middle ranks of the harem, never advancing far enough to achieve real power, never falling far enough to face execution. They lived out their years in a golden cage, their youth consumed by waiting for attention that might never come, their maturity consumed by maintaining positions that might disappear without warning, and some, like Mahidevran, were destroyed. Destroyed not for what they did, but for what they represented, not for crimes they committed, but for inconveniences they posed. Not by justice, but by power, wearing the mask of justice. The system lasted as long as the empire lasted. When the Sultanate fell, the harem fell with it. Its residents dispersed, its records partially preserved in archives that scholars have only recently begun to examine, without the filters of imperial or nationalist ideology. What those examinations reveal is a system of extraordinary sophistication and extraordinary cruelty. An institution that managed reproduction and succession with bureaucratic efficiency while disposing of inconvenient women with bureaucratic efficiency as well. The same attention to detail that made the Ottomans effective administrators of a vast empire made them effective administrators of domestic terror. Remember Mahi Divan? Remember the black water of the Bosphorus closing over her head? Remember the cats and snakes that shared her death? The darkness that swallowed her? The innocence that saved nothing? Remember Nir Banu, who ordered her destruction and rose to power over her body? Remember that the perpetrators often thrived while the victims disappeared without trace. Remember that justice was not part of this system, that the system was designed to serve power rather than truth. Remember the mutes who carried out the sentences, the eunuchs who administered the harem, the valid sultans who ruled over empires of women with absolute authority. Remember that the system required all of these people, that its cruelty was distributed across a bureaucracy that allowed everyone to claim they were merely following orders. Remember the witnesses, the hundreds of women who watched their fellow women die and knew that they might be next. The terror that shaped their lives, the choices they made to survive, the humanity they preserved or lost within a system designed to destroy it. Remember that this was civilization. This was empire. This was the heart of a realm that considered itself the greatest power on earth, the center of Islamic culture, the inheritor of Roman and Byzantine glory. Remember what civilization has sometimes meant. Subscribe if you want more histories that reveal what lies beneath the beautiful surfaces of the past. Comment below, telling me where you are watching from. Share this video with anyone who thinks they understand the Ottoman Empire from the architecture and the artifacts and the official histories. Because the Ottoman Empire was not only the Blue Mosque and the Topkapi Palace and the conquest that reshaped the Mediterranean world. It was also Mahidevran being sewn into a sack at the edge of the Bosphorus. Her screams muffled by canvas as the water closed over her head. It was also the system that killed her. The officials who administered it, the women who survived by learning its rules. It was also the silence that followed the records that concealed. The history that preferred not to examine too closely what happened to the women who entered the harem and never emerged. Remember them? Remember, what does it mean that such a system existed for 5 centuries at the heart of one of history's great civilizations? It means that civilization and cruelty are not opposites. They are companions, often expressions of the same underlying dynamics. The Ottoman Empire produced magnificent architecture, sophisticated literature, advances in mathematics and astronomy. It also produced the sack and the boring, the mute executioners, and the Bosphorus full of bodies. Both were Ottoman. Both were real. Both were products of the same system. The women who suffered within the harem were not incidental to Ottoman greatness. They were essential to it. The system that controlled their bodies and their sexuality was the system that ensured stable succession, prevented civil war, maintained the continuity of imperial power across generations. The cruelty served purposes that Ottoman administrators considered vital. This does not justify the cruelty. Nothing justifies the cruelty. But it explains why the cruelty persisted, why reforms were resisted, why the system maintained itself across 5 centuries of change in nearly every other aspect of Ottoman society. The women who died in the Bosphorus were sacrifices to dynastic stability. Their deaths were the price of preventing the succession conflicts that had destroyed other empires, that had plunged other societies into civil war and fragmentation. The Ottomans looked at that price and concluded it was worth paying. We can see their calculation clearly now from our distance in time. We can see how the logic worked. How reasonable men could convince themselves that drowning women in sacks full of starving cats was necessary for the greater good. We can see the mechanisms of justification, the religious frameworks that sanctioned the violence, the political frameworks that demanded it. And we can see that the logic was wrong, that the violence was excessive, disproportionate, unjustified by any necessity that actually existed. That innocent women died because the system was designed to produce their deaths, not because their deaths served any genuine purpose. But the men who administered the system did not see what we see. They saw necessity where we see cruelty. They saw justice where we see murder. They saw the preservation of order where we see the destruction of lives. This is perhaps the most disturbing lesson the Ottoman harem offers. Not that cruel systems existed because cruel systems have always existed, but that cruel systems can persist for centuries, administered by ordinary people who believe they are doing what is right, who cannot see the horror that later observers will find obvious. What systems do we maintain today that future generations will regard with similar horror? What practices do we accept as normal that will be condemned as barbaric by those who come after us? What are we failing to see? Because we are inside the system, because the logic seems sound, because the alternatives seem worse. The women of the Ottoman harem cannot answer these questions. They are gone. Their voice is silent. Their suffering preserved only in fragments and records that barely capture what they experienced. But we can answer. We can look at the past honestly, learn from what it reveals, and ask whether we are making similar mistakes with different victims.